One stormy night, a lonely millionaire, Arthur Cole, finds a pregnant woman crying in the rain in front of his imposing mansion. Moved by compassion, he decides to help her by taking her into his home. However, as their relationship grows, Arthur discovers dark secrets from her past that connect directly to his own. What began as a gesture of kindness unleashes a plot of mysteries, betrayals, and devastating revelations that will change both their lives forever. The rain fell heavily, battering the roof of Arthur Cole's immense mansion. Each drop seemed to echo through the empty corridors, filling the silence with a sound that reminded him of his loneliness. Arthur watched the storm from his living room, the glass of wine resting in his hand almost untouched. The yellowish lights reflected off the marble walls and luxurious furniture, but the man who owned it all felt empty. He had always said that success came at a price, but he had never imagined that the price was everything. Friends, family, love. These were things he had left behind, justifying his choices as necessary to conquer the empire he now ruled. At 45, Arthur was one of the most respected and feared businessmen in the country, but his life was as uninhabited as the long corridors of his house. The wind blew hard, rattling the windows, and it was at that moment that he realized something. From the top of the staircase leading to his library, Arthur saw a figure in front of the estate's iron gate. He frowned, trying to see better. It was a woman. She was completely drenched, holding her swollen belly with both hands. Even from a distance, he could see the desperation in her posture. Her shoulders bowed and her head lowered, as if she were on the verge of collapse. Arthur hesitated. For a moment, he thought about ignoring it. It wasn't unusual for people to try to get his attention for some favor or charity. However, something about the woman's figure disconcerted him. She seemed so vulnerable. "Jensen," he called, and the butler appeared almost instantly as usual. "Yes, sir. There's a woman at the gate. Check what she wants." Jensen, a man of advanced age and unwavering loyalty, peered out of the window and saw the same scene. "She looks like she needs help, sir." Arthur sighed, leaving his glass of wine on the glass table. He hated being disturbed, but something in his instincts pushed him to act. "Open the gate. Let her in." Minutes later, the woman stood in the doorway, her hair dripping water on the polished marble floor. She was shivering, not just from the cold, but also from fear. Her skin was pale and her eyes red from crying. Arthur watched her from a distance without approaching. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice cold and authoritative. "My name is Eleanor," she replied almost in a whisper. Her voice carried a weariness that went beyond the physical. "I didn't know where to go." Arthur narrowed his eyes, trying to understand why she was there. "Why were you at my door? What do you want from me?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she clasped her hands around her belly, as if protecting the baby. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky. "I just need a safe place. Please, I don't have anyone else." Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Oh, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. There was a long silence. Arthur, as reluctant as he was, couldn't shake the image of her alone in the rain, crying. He sighed and signaled to Jensen. "Prepare a room for her," he said, before turning to Elena. "You can stay tonight. Tomorrow we'll work out what to do with you." Elena murmured a barely audible thank you before being led by the butler to one of the guest rooms. Arthur stood alone in the room, staring at the puddle of water she had left on the floor. He felt a heaviness in his chest that he didn't recognize. Something about that woman intrigued him, but he didn't know what. Dawn was slowly breaking. Arthur lay in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind wandered, returning again and again to Elena's figure. He tried to convince himself that she was just another lost person who needed help, but that didn't explain the restlessness he felt. On the other side of the house, Eleanor couldn't sleep either. Sitting on her bed, wrapped in a warm blanket, she stared into nothingness. Her hand slid across her belly as she whispered words of comfort to the baby. "It's all right now," she said, although her voice indicated otherwise. "We're safe, at least for now." She looked at the window and saw the reflection of her own face, pale and tired. A tear escaped from her eye, and she wiped it away quickly, as if to erase any sign of weakness. She couldn't afford to be weak. Not now. The next morning, Arthur found Elena in the kitchen, where Jensen had prepared hot tea for her. She was sitting at the table, fiddling with her cup, but not really drinking. When Arthur came in, she looked up briefly, but then went back to her tea. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, with a tone that sounded more like an obligation than genuine interest. "Yes, thank you," she replied without much conviction. Arthur sat down on the other side of the table, crossing his arms. He needed answers. Something about her bothered him, something he couldn't identify. You said you don't have anyone. Does that include the child's father? Eleanor swallowed, clutching her cup tighter. Yes. Arthur sensed the hesitation in her answer but didn't press. He knew that people had their reasons for hiding things, and pushing would get him nowhere. However, one thing was clear to him. She was running away from something or someone. It's not safe for you to be wandering around, he finally said. If you want, you can stay here for a few more days until we work out what to do. Elena looked up at him in surprise. Why are you helping me? Arthur was silent for a moment. He didn't know exactly why. Perhaps it was the desperation he had seen in her eyes the night before, or perhaps it was something else, something deeper that he still didn't understand. Because I can, he replied simply, before getting up and leaving the kitchen. Eleanor stood alone, staring at the door through which he had left. She knew he was a distant man, someone who probably preferred to be alone, but at that moment, she sensed that there was more to him than he let on. Arthur had been gone all day, and when he returned in the evening, he was in his office going through some papers and found something that made him stop. It was a small silver locket that he didn't recognize, probably something Elena had dropped, and her employee had put it there. He opened it and found an inscription engraved inside, "Forever in your debt." The phrase hit him like a punch. He knew where it came from. It was a memory he had been trying to forget for years, something he believed was buried in the past. But now, the past seemed to have come back to haunt him. The dawn advanced slowly and restlessly. The sound of the rain, now just a persistent drip, echoed through the halls of the mansion. Arthur was sitting in his study, his eyes fixed on the locket he had found. It was impossible to ignore the words engraved on it, and even more impossible to ignore the connection he felt, growing with Elena, even if he didn't understand why. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, found himself drawn into the past. 20 years earlier, there had been a woman, Livia Montenegro, a young woman full of life, with sparkling eyes and a smile that would disarm anyone. He had met her at a crucial moment in his career, when success seemed within reach, but morality was beginning to dissolve. Livia had trusted him, and he had betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. He never knew what happened to her afterwards. He never had the courage to look. Now in front of Elena, he felt the weight of the past returning. Was she the key to righting his wrongs, or was she just another opportunity for fate to take its toll on him? He didn't know, but something inside him told him he couldn't ignore it. In the guest room, Eleanor was lying in bed, but sleep was not coming. The memory of the black car that had followed her there was still fresh in her mind. She knew she didn't have long before Calloway, the father of her child, found out where she was. The thought of falling into his hands again was unbearable. She closed her eyes and squeezed her belly, whispering softly to the baby. "I promise I'll protect you," she said, as silent tears streamed down her face. "No matter what I have to do." She got out of bed and walked over to the window. The garden of the mansion looked like a gloomy picture in the moonlight, with the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. It was then that she saw something that made her heart freeze. At the edge of the estate, beyond the gates, a black car was parked. There were no lights on, but she knew they were there. Calloway had sent his men. Elena stepped back, almost tripping over her own feet, and ran for the door. She left the room in the direction of Arthur's office, without thinking of anything other than warning him. When she arrived, she opened the door without knocking, which made Arthur look up in surprise. "What happened?" he asked, seeing the panic on her face. "They're here," she said, her voice shaking. "I saw the car. They found me." Arthur was silent for a moment, absorbing the information. He stood up slowly, leaving the locket on the table, and walked over to Elena. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. "Yes, I recognize that car. It's them. If you don't send me away now, they'll hurt you too. They have no limits." Arthur looked at her, his eyes fixed on hers. There was a mixture of fear and determination in that look, something that reminded him of Livia. He took a deep breath and put a firm hand on Elena's shoulder. "You're not going anywhere. If they're here, I'll deal with them." Before she could protest, Arthur left the office, calling Jensen. The butler appeared within seconds, and Arthur gave clear instructions. "Reinforce security, lock all entrances, and call the head of the mansion's private security team." Meanwhile, Elena was standing in the middle of the corridor, feeling torn between relief and guilt. "I shouldn't be here," she said when Arthur returned. "That's not your problem." "You're right," he replied with a slightly wry smile, "but I'm not the type to ignore people in danger." And as it turns out, you're in more danger than I thought." Eleanor felt the tears coming back but held them back. This was no time for weakness. She looked at Arthur, trying to understand why he was doing all this. He had seemed so distant and indifferent, but now he was willing to face something she knew was deadly dangerous. "I just need time," she said. "Time to figure out how to disappear for real." "Time is what you'll get," he replied. "But as long as you're here, you're under my protection." Eleanor didn't know what to say. There was something in Arthur's tone, something definitive that made her believe him. But at the same time, she knew that Calloway was not someone who backed down easily. He was a man who would destroy any obstacle in his path, and Elena knew that better than anyone. The evening progressed, and the tension in the mansion was almost palpable. Arthur was in his office again, surrounded by dossiers and information that his private investigator had sent. He had asked for everything about Calloway and his connection to Eleanor, and what he had discovered made him even more determined to protect her. Calloway was a ruthless and calculating man, a tycoon with a fortune that rivaled Arthur's, but who operated in the underworld of illicit business. He was known for crushing his enemies mercilessly and treating people like pawns in a larger game. Discovering that Elena had been married to such a man made Arthur wonder what she had gone through to get there. As he read the report, something caught his eye. An old photo of Calloway, taken at a gala event years ago. Next to him was a woman. It took Arthur a moment to process what he was seeing. The woman in the photo was Livia Montenegro. His heart raced. He didn't know what it meant, but it was more than a coincidence. Elena hadn't just appeared in his life. She was connected to his past in a way he still didn't understand. He picked up the locket on the table and held it tightly, as if that small object could give him the answers he was looking for. Suddenly, he heard a sound coming from downstairs, a metallic noise as if something had been forced. Arthur dropped the locket and left the office, hurrying down the stairs. He found Jensen in the hallway, his expression tense. "Sir, I think someone tried to break in," said the butler. "The security team is investigating, but they seem to have backed off." Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. This was only the beginning. He knew Calloway wouldn't give up so easily. He went upstairs again and went to Eleanor's room. He found her sitting on the bed, hugging her knees, her eyes fixed on the window. "It's all right," he said, trying to sound convincing. "They tried something, but they didn't succeed." Elena looked up at him, tears running silently down her cheeks. "You don't understand. It will never stop. It will keep coming closer and closer until it gets what it wants." Arthur came closer and sat on the edge of the bed, something he never imagined he would do. "And what does he want, Elena? Why you? Why the baby?" She took a deep breath, trying to find the words. "The baby isn't just his son. It's the heir he needs. Calloway doesn't care about me. He only cares about his legacy. And if he catches me, he'll take my son away from me. I can't let that happen." Arthur looked at her for a long moment, seeing the pain and fear in her eyes. He knew she was telling the truth, and he knew that somehow he was involved in this more than he realized. "You won't fight alone," he said at last. "I promise." As the words left his mouth, Arthur felt the weight of everything that was to come. He knew he was putting himself in the way of something dangerous, but he also knew he couldn't turn back. The past was mixing with the present, and the only way to deal with it was to face the storm head-on. Arthur was silent for a moment, trying to organize the confusing pieces of that story. He looked at Elena, who was clearly exhausted, and yet there was something about her that deeply intrigued him. She was young, beautiful, delicate, but her eyes carried a pain that seemed much older than her. It made him uneasy. "Why you?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "You're beautiful, young. Why did you marry a man like Calloway, an older man, dangerous and involved in things that have clearly hurt you?" Eleanor raised her eyes slowly, as if deciding whether she could trust him. She took a deep, hesitant breath before finally speaking. "He was an acquaintance of my mother's. I met him when I was a teenager, but I never imagined that we would ever get involved. When my mother died, I was alone, completely alone in the world. I had no family. I didn't know what to do with my life." She paused, staring into nothingness, as if revisiting a place that made her feel even more fragile. Calloway appeared at that moment as someone who was willing to help me. He seemed kind, attentive, as if he could be a safe haven. I thought he wanted to take care of me, and I foolishly trusted. Arthur noticed the tremor in her voice and the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the bed. It was as if every word brought back memories she wanted to forget. "But that didn't last," she continued. "After we got married, he changed. It started with small things, controlling what I did, what I wore. Then came the threats. If I didn't do what he wanted, he'd say he'd break up with me, and I believed him. He's the kind of man who keeps his promises. Arthur felt a pang of anger growing inside him. He wasn't a man of exaggerated emotions, but imagining someone treating Elena like that stirred something he couldn't control. He leaned slightly towards her, trying to understand more. "And your son's father?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "Is he really Calloway?" Elena shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips as if it were an absurd question. "Of course it is. It's Calloway. He made sure of that. He said that if I left him, he'd still have something of mine, something that would connect him to me forever." Her voice failed her, and she brought her hands to her face, trying to hide the tears that were now falling hard. Arthur stood there motionless, feeling helpless, but at the same time determined not to let it continue. "What about your father? Isn't there anyone in your family who can help?" Eleanor slowly removed her hands from her face, looking at Arthur with a deep emptiness in her eyes. "I never knew who he was. My mother never told me. When I was a child, I used to ask, but she always avoided the subject. She said it was complicated, that one day I would understand, but that day never came." Arthur felt the ground shake beneath his feet, but he didn't let it show. That story affected him in a way he didn't want to admit. The medallion on his desk, the connection with Livia Montenegro, everything seemed to start to make sense, but he couldn't say anything. Not yet. "So you're alone," he said, more as a statement than a question. Eleanor nodded, squeezing her belly gently, as if that gesture was the only thing keeping her on her feet. "Alone and afraid. But no matter what happens to me, I won't let him hurt my son. He's not going to grow up as Calloway's property." There was a long silence between the two of them. Arthur felt the weight of her words, the determination mixed with fear, and, for the first time in a long time, he felt responsible for something other than himself. "You're not going to face this alone," he finally said, with a firmness that surprised even himself. "As long as you're here, you're safe. And I'm going to make sure it stays that way." She looked at him, surprised, and for a brief moment a glimmer of hope crossed her eyes, but it soon faded, replaced by the skepticism that years of abuse had planted in her heart. "You don't understand," she muttered. "Calloway isn't the kind of man who accepts losing. He'll keep coming. And when he finds out I'm here, he'll destroy you too." Arthur stood up, walking over to the window. He looked out into the garden, where security guards were now circulating around the estate, on the lookout for any suspicious movement. He knew Calloway was powerful, but that didn't intimidate him. Not anymore. "Let him try," he said, without looking at her. "I've lost too many things in my life, but this I won't lose." Eleanor remained silent, not knowing how to respond. It didn't make sense to her. Why would a man like Arthur Cole, so distant, so powerful, care about someone like her? But at the same time, there was something in his gaze, something that seemed more personal than simple compassion. That evening, while Arthur was in his office, he picked up the locket again. He looked at the engraved words and closed his eyes, trying to calm the storm that was growing inside him. Livia Montenegro. Past and present were mixing in a way he had never imagined, and now Eleanor was at the center of it all. He knew he couldn't protect Eleanor with words alone. Calloway was a dangerous man, and Arthur needed something more. He picked up the phone and called his private investigator. "I want more information about Henry Calloway," he said, "and about Livia Montenegro. Everything you can find as soon as possible." On the other end of the line, the investigator nodded, confirming that he would start work immediately. Arthur hung up and remained silent for a few moments. He looked at the locket once more and whispered to himself, "Livia, I've failed you, but I won't fail her." In her room, Elena tried to sleep, but the nightmares wouldn't let her. She saw Calloway's face, heard his threatening voice, and woke up startled. She looked out of the window again and saw the black car still stopped in the distance, like a constant reminder that her freedom was hanging by a thread. "I need to protect you," she whispered, stroking her belly, "even if it costs me everything." The danger was getting closer, but neither Elena nor Arthur knew that the secrets that connected them were about to explode, changing their lives forever. Arthur was in his office, the silence of the early morning weighing on him like a suffocating veil. The information his private investigator had gathered was spread out on the desk. Old photos, reports, and newspaper clippings told the story of Livia Montenegro. Every detail made the knot in his chest tighten even more. She had never been married. She had raised her daughter alone, facing difficulties he could barely imagine. He ran a hand over his face, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions that was growing inside him. The question that now dominated his mind was one he had never expected to face. What if Elena is my daughter? The thought was so disturbing that he had to get up and walk around the office trying to push it away. But the implacable logic wouldn't leave him alone. Livia had suddenly disappeared from his life, shortly after the moment he had chosen to leave her behind out of ambition. He knew that he had hurt her deeply, but he had never imagined that there could be something more, something like a pregnancy that she had decided to face alone. Arthur sat back down, staring at a photo of Livia holding a baby. The baby was Elena. There was something in the woman's expression, a mixture of sadness and strength that made him feel an unbearable tightness in his chest. If it was true, if Elena was his daughter, fate had set a cruel course to bring them together. But how could he confirm this without raising expectations or worse, destroying her life even more? He knew he had to proceed with caution. Elena was already dealing with a lot of pain. Revealing this possibility now, without knowing for sure, would be reckless. He needed answers, but without her knowing. The next morning, Arthur found Eleanor in the living room. She looked more dejected than ever, with deep-set eyes and a pale face. Despite her beauty, the sadness she carried made her seem even more fragile. She was stirring the cup of tea Jensen had prepared for her, but clearly had no appetite. "Are you all right?" he asked, breaking the silence with a gentler tone than he was used to. She nodded, but her expression said otherwise. "I'm just tired," she replied, her voice almost faint. Arthur felt the urge to comfort her, but held back. He didn't want to seem more involved than he already was. But as he looked at her, he saw a reflection of Livia, the same strength mixed with vulnerability, the same determination to carry on despite everything. "I'll make sure you're safe here," he finally said, more to fill the silence than anything else. Elena looked at him with a small, sad smile. "I thank you for everything, but I still don't understand why you're doing this. Why do you care so much about me?" Arthur didn't answer right away. How could he? How could he explain that perhaps she was the last chance he had to right a wrong that had haunted him for decades? Instead, he looked away and changed the subject. "You should rest. I'll take care of everything." Later the same day, Arthur made a discreet call to a trusted laboratory. He asked them to carry out a DNA test, but the hardest part would be getting Elena's material without her knowing. He had to be careful. Jensen, who had served him for years and knew how to keep secrets, was called into the office. "I need your help with something delicate," said Arthur, with a more serious tone than usual. "Of course, sir," replied Jensen, tilting his head slightly. Arthur explained what he needed: a strand of hair, a brush, something that could provide genetic material for the test. Jensen didn't ask any questions, but his eyes showed that he understood the gravity of the situation. That evening, while Elena was in the shower, Jensen discreetly entered her room. Carefully, he picked up a few strands of hair that were stuck to the brush. It was a simple task, but it carried a huge emotional weight. He knew that his boss rarely got involved in personal matters, and this situation was clearly consuming him. The next few days were a torment for Arthur. The wait for the test results seemed endless, and every moment with Elena made his doubts grow. He watched her more closely now, looking for traces of himself in her, something that would confirm what he feared and hoped for at the same time. Elena, on the other hand, was beginning to notice that there was something different about Arthur. He seemed more distant, more pensive, as if he were carrying an invisible weight. She tried to ignore it, attributing it to the fact that her presence was disrupting his life. One evening, while walking down the corridor, she stopped in front of Arthur's office and heard low voices. He was on the phone, and his voice sounded more tense than ever. "I need the results as soon as possible," he said. "No, it can't wait. It's urgent." Elena frowned, confused. Arthur seemed preoccupied with something important, but she couldn't imagine what it could be. She went back to her room, trying to shake off the discomfort she felt. A few days later, the envelope with the results arrived. Arthur was alone in his office when he opened the document, his hands shaking slightly. He read the words carefully, each sentence seeming to shout louder than the last. The result was clear. 99.9% match. Elena was his daughter. Arthur dropped the paper on the table, resting his head in his hands. The mixture of emotions was overwhelming. Guilt, fear, relief, and above all, the feeling that fate was playing a cruel and inescapable game with him. He had a daughter he had indirectly abandoned by leaving Livia alone to face everything. But what would he do now? How could he tell Elena? She was already overwhelmed, trying to protect her child from a cruel man. Revealing this truth now could completely destabilize her. Arthur knew he had to wait for the right moment. He needed to find a way to tell her without destroying what little stability she had found. But at the same time, every day that passed without revealing the truth was another day of carrying a secret that was eating him up inside. That night, he went to Elena's room, stopping at the open door. She was lying down, her hand on her stomach, looking more peaceful than usual. He lay there for a few minutes, watching her in silence, trying to find the words. "Good night," he finally said, his voice softer than he had intended. Elena opened her eyes and smiled slightly. "Good night." Arthur turned and left, but as he walked down the corridor, a single phrase echoed in his mind. "I need to tell her." But how? The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, but the game was far from over. Arthur now knew the truth, but what would he do with it? And all the while, the danger posed by Calloway continued to grow, threatening not only Elena, but also the future he was beginning to envision with her. Arthur spent the whole night in bed. Sitting in his leather armchair in the darkness of his office, he held the DNA test report in his hands. The words were clear, inescapable. Elena was his daughter. A mixture of guilt and despair consumed every fiber of his being. He thought of Livia, how he had abandoned her years ago, believing he was just following his ambition, but now knowing that she had faced everything alone, a pregnancy, raising a daughter, surviving in a cruel world, was a devastating blow. Worse still was the feeling that fate had deliberately planned this irony. How to explain to Elena that the man who was trying to protect her now was the same one who had indirectly condemned her to a life of suffering? How to tell her that, after all, he was her father? In the morning, when the sun began to illuminate the mansion, Arthur was still in his study, his eyes deep and red with fatigue. Elena entered the room looking equally haggard. She hesitated to see him there, so somber, but eventually approached him. "Are you all right?" she asked almost in a whisper. Arthur looked up at her, feeling a pang in his chest. That was his daughter's face, his daughter. For a moment, he almost confessed everything, but logic prevailed. "Not now, not like this. I am," he lied, trying to sound firm. "I'm just worried about the situation. Calloway is not a man who gives up easily." Elena nodded, taking a seat opposite him. Her eyes were sad, but there was something else, a slight curiosity, as if she realized that Arthur was hiding something. "You've been acting strange these past few days," she said, her voice quavering. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Arthur looked away, the tension growing inside him. How could he hide the truth from her? But how could he tell her? He needed to buy time to find the right way to reveal everything. "It's nothing," he finally said, his voice firm but without conviction. "Just trying to sort everything out. You don't have to worry." Eleanor narrowed her eyes, clearly suspicious, but didn't insist. She knew Arthur wasn't the kind of man who opened up easily. That afternoon, Arthur called the investigator again. He needed more information about Livia's past, about the years she had disappeared from his life. What had she faced? Why had she never tried to look for him? "She seemed to want to hide something," explained the investigator, as he detailed his findings. "After you cut ties with her, she was fired from her job. There were rumors that she was pregnant, but she never confirmed to anyone who the father was. She worked simple jobs, moved several times. When Elena was born, she was living alone in a small apartment. It seems that she avoided any kind of contact with the past." Arthur felt the weight of his guilt grow even heavier. Livia had suffered because of him, not just emotionally but also materially. He could have helped, but he had chosen to turn his back, and she, proud as she was, had faced everything alone. "She died in a car accident, didn't she?" asked Arthur, his voice hoarse. "Yes," confirmed the investigator. "There's something curious about that, sir. According to the reports, her car was hit by a speeding driver, but the driver was someone associated with Calloway." Arthur stopped, his mind working rapidly. Calloway. He had no idea that the man was connected to this, but now the idea seemed to form clearly. Did Calloway have something to do with Livia's death? And if so, why? "Keep investigating," he ordered. "I need to know everything." Later that evening, Elena was in the living room staring at the burning fireplace. She seemed lost in thought, her eyes fixed on the flames. Arthur came in and stood at a distance, watching her for a moment before approaching. "You look thoughtful," he commented, taking a seat next to her. "I'm thinking about my mother," she said without taking her eyes off the fire. "She was everything to me, you know. She was always so strong, so determined. I used to think she could do anything, but now thinking back she seemed to carry so much suffering, so much weight. Arthur felt a knot forming in his throat. She never talked about her father, he asked, trying to sound casual. Eleanor shook her head. No. Whenever I asked, she wouldn't say anything. She said he wasn't important, that we didn't need him, but I think she cared more than she said. I think she suffered because of him. Arthur looked away, unable to face her. Haven't you ever thought about trying to find him? I have, she admitted, but at the same time I think it would be pointless. If he didn't care about us, why should I look for him? My mother did what she could to give me a life, even without him. Arthur felt a crushing weight in her words. She was right. He had failed them both, and now more than ever he needed to correct that mistake. I think she'd be proud of you, he said at last, his voice soft. You're strong, brave, like her. Elena looked at him, surprised by the softness in his tone. Thank you, she said sincerely. The next day, the investigator returned with even more disturbing information. Calloway had met Livia years before her death. He had been interested in her, but she had rejected him. After that, it seemed that Calloway had begun to pursue her discreetly, as if he were obsessed with her. It's possible, said the investigator carefully, that the car accident wasn't exactly an accident. Arthur remained silent, anger growing inside him. Calloway had already stolen so much from Elena, and now it seemed likely that he had stolen Livia's life too. This couldn't go on. I need proof, he said firmly. If Calloway had anything to do with it, I want the whole world to know. The investigator nodded and left, leaving Arthur alone to deal with his conflicting emotions. Meanwhile, Elena began to notice that something was changing. Arthur seemed more distant, more worried. She sensed that he was hiding something, but she didn't know what it was. His behavior made her uneasy, but at the same time, she felt safe by his side. One evening, she confronted him. Arthur, what's going on? You seem different. He hesitated for a moment, but knew he couldn't go on like this for much longer. Elena, I'm just trying to protect you. Everything I'm doing is to make sure you and your son are safe. She looked at him, trying to decipher what was behind his words. Why do you care so much? We barely know each other. Arthur held her gaze, fighting the urge to tell her everything, but he wasn't ready yet. He didn't know how she would react, and he didn't want to risk breaking the fragile trust they had built up. Because I know what it's like to lose everything, he finally replied, and I'm not going to let that happen to you. Elena nodded slowly, still suspicious but not insistent. She knew there was more to the story, but perhaps time would reveal all. Meanwhile, Arthur knew he was running out of time. Calloway was getting closer and closer, and the truth about his connection with Elena was about to come out, whether he was ready for it or not. The following days were a mixture of growing tension and silences, laden with unspoken meanings. Arthur kept a relentless watch, his orders to the security team turning the mansion into a virtual fortress. All the time, his mind oscillated between the imminent danger of Calloway and the weight of the secret he carried about Elena. He knew he couldn't put it off much longer. However, the revelation seemed like an impossible chasm to cross. Every time he looked at Eleanor, he saw not only the woman he wanted to protect, but also the overwhelming possibility that he was her father. What if she rejected that truth? What if she was never able to forgive him for everything that had happened? That afternoon, Elena was in the garden, trying to enjoy a rare moment of peace. Sitting under the shade of a tree, she absent-mindedly stroked her belly as she gazed at the horizon. She felt the growing unease around her, Arthur more distant, the tension that seemed to seep into even the most tranquil moments. I just want you to be safe, she whispered to the baby, feeling the tears threaten to flow. None of that matters as long as you're okay. Arthur watched her from afar, standing on the balcony. He held an envelope in his hands, the same envelope containing the results of the DNA test. How many times had he promised himself to tell the truth? How many times had hesitation consumed him? He started down the stairs towards the garden, but stopped when he heard Jensen's voice calling out to him. Mr. Cole, we need to talk, it's urgent. Arthur turned around, his countenance closed. He followed Jensen into the study, where the butler locked the door before he began to speak. We've received information that Calloway is on the move, said Jensen, his voice deep. He has men in nearby towns. It seems he's trying to find out where Miss Elena is hiding. Arthur clenched his fists, a flash of anger crossing his face. What if he finds out? If he finds out, sir, he won't come with diplomacy. Calloway is not the kind of man who knocks on doors. He'll break in, and he'll break in hard. Arthur felt the weight of those words. It wasn't just Elena who was in danger. It was also her son, her unborn grandson. The thought of losing them both was unbearable. "Reinforce security," he ordered. "I want you to monitor all the entrances to the estate. No one enters without my permission." Jensen nodded and left, leaving Arthur alone with his thoughts. He picked up the envelope again. The paper crumpled from being held and dropped. How could he protect Elena without telling her the truth? But how could he tell the truth when the fear of losing her paralyzed him? That night, Arthur's private investigator showed up at the mansion with some disturbing new information. "I've discovered something about Livia Montenegro's death," he said, placing a dossier on the table. Arthur opened the file, his eyes quickly scanning the pages. There were police reports, accident records, and even testimonies from people who had been at the scene. One name stood out repeatedly: Henry Calloway. "There is evidence that the driver who caused the accident worked for Calloway at the time," explained the investigator. "But the case was dismissed as an ordinary accident. Calloway has too much influence, and nothing has been thoroughly investigated." Arthur felt his blood boil. Calloway had not only destroyed Elena's life, but was also directly responsible for Livia's death. He knew with overwhelming certainty that it hadn't been an accident. Calloway had eliminated Livia because she represented something he couldn't control. "Is that enough to put you in prison?" asked Arthur, his voice harsh. "Maybe," replied the investigator hesitantly, "but it would be difficult. Calloway has powerful lawyers and an army of men willing to do his bidding. We'd need something more concrete." Arthur took a deep breath, trying to contain his anger. He knew that taking on Calloway would be a dangerous battle, but he was willing to go all the way. Later that evening, Arthur found Elena in the living room. She was sitting on the sofa with a blanket over her shoulders. He paused at the door, watching her for a moment before entering. "Can we talk?" he asked, taking a seat next to her. Elena nodded, although she looked nervous. "I have something to tell you," he began, his voice lower than usual. She looked at him expectantly. Arthur hesitated. For a moment, he almost confessed everything, but the words seemed to get stuck in his throat. He looked away, fighting the whirlwind of emotions that overwhelmed him. "I've heard more about Calloway," he finally said, changing the subject. "I think he had something to do with your mother's death." Elena's eyes widened, shock evident on her face. What? What do you mean?" "There's evidence that the accident wasn't an accident," he explained. "Calloway was involved. It seems he considered her a problem." Elena brought her hands to her mouth, the tears coming before she could control them. He killed her. My mother." Arthur nodded, speechless. He knew this revelation would destroy her, but it was necessary. "I won't let him hurt anyone else," he said, his voice firm. "I promise you, Elena, I'll put an end to it." She looked at him, tears streaming down her face. "You don't have to do this for me," she whispered. "You've already done so much." "I'm not just doing it for you," he replied without thinking. She stared at him, confused. "Then why? Why do you care so much?" Arthur felt his heart race. The truth was about to explode out of him, but he held it back once again. This wasn't the time, not yet. "Because you deserve a chance," he said at last. "A chance to be happy. You and your son." Elena nodded slowly, but still looked confused. She didn't know why Arthur was so committed, but she sensed that there was something else he wasn't saying. Meanwhile, Calloway's men were closing in. Informants had reported the location of Arthur's mansion, and Calloway was determined to get Elena back. He couldn't tolerate being challenged, let alone losing control over something he considered his own. The tension in the mansion was growing by the day. Arthur knew that the confrontation was approaching, but he also knew that before it did, he had to tell Elena the truth. He couldn't put it off any longer. That night, he went to her room, determined. Elena was sitting on the bed, stroking her belly. She looked up at him when he entered, immediately realizing that something was different. "Arthur?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "I need to tell you something," he said, closing the door behind him. He sat down next to her, his expression serious. Elena watched him, clearly worried. "I discovered something about your mother," he began, "something that could change everything." She didn't answer, but her breath seemed to catch in her chest. "I knew your mother, Elena," he finally said. "Many years ago, I had a relationship with her, and now, after everything that's happened, I think I'm your father." The words hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Elena stared at him, her mouth slightly open but unable to say anything. "I wasn't sure," he continued. "I did a DNA test without you knowing, and the result confirms it." Elena brought her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She shook her head, unable to process what she had just heard. "Are you my father?" she whispered at last. Arthur nodded, the weight of the confession evident in his eyes. The truth had been exposed, but what would come next was far from certain. Eleanor felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Arthur's words echoed in her mind, but their meaning seemed impossible to assimilate. Was he her father? The man who had suddenly become her safe haven was actually the missing piece she had always wanted to find, but had never believed existed. "It can't be," she murmured, her voice trembling. Her hand instinctively rested on her stomach, as if that would help her balance. "Elena," Arthur began, his voice laden with guilt and a touch of pleading, "I know this is hard to hear, and I know I should have told you before, but I was afraid of how you would react, afraid that it would be too late to put right everything I did wrong." She looked at him, her eyes full of tears but also of confusion. "Did you know all this time? Did you know you were my father?" "No," he answered immediately, shaking his head. "I suspected after you got here. When I saw the locket, when you talked about your mother, I wasn't sure, so I took the test. I only got the results a few days ago." Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to control the whirlwind forming inside her. "My mother? Did she know? Did she know where you were? Why didn't you ever tell me anything?" Arthur looked away, feeling the weight of every word he was about to say. "Livia was proud. When I chose my job over her, I broke off contact completely. I never knew she was pregnant. If I'd known," he paused, his voice breaking, "if I'd known, I would have done everything differently." Eleanor let out a bitter laugh, an expression of disbelief forming on her face. "Done it differently? You think you can just show up now and change everything? Where were you when she was alone? When I was growing up with no one? You say you didn't know, but what does that change? You never looked. You never tried to find out what happened to her." Arthur felt her every word like a stab. He knew she was right. There was no excuse that could erase the years of absence, the suffering that Livia and Eleanor had faced because of their choices. "I know," he said, his voice firm but full of regret. "I know I can't change the past. I know I failed you and your mother, but I'm here now, and I won't fail you again." "And what does that mean?" she asked, the tears flowing freely now. "Do you want me to just accept it? To trust you, to forgive you? Because I don't know if I can, Arthur." So, Dad, I don't even know what to call you." "Call me whatever you want," he replied, his voice trembling for the first time. "I don't expect you to forgive me now, maybe ever, but I want you to know that, however much I've failed you in the past, I won't fail you and your son. I will protect you both, whatever the cost." Elena shook her head, trying to process everything. The pain, anger, and confusion inside her were almost unbearable. She got out of bed and walked over to the window, looking out into the darkness outside. "I need time," she said finally, without turning to him. "I need time to think, to understand all this." Arthur nodded, although she couldn't see him. "I'll give you as much time as you need," he said, getting up too. "But please know that I'm here, and that I'm going to do everything I can to make it right." He left the room, feeling more defeated than ever. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall, closing his eyes as he tried to control the pain that was consuming him. Was it too late? Had he lost the chance to have any kind of relationship with his daughter? That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. Arthur's words echoed in her mind, mixed with memories of her mother. Livia had always been a mystery in many ways, but now it all seemed to make sense. Why she never talked about her father, the sadness that sometimes crossed her face when she thought Elena wasn't looking. She felt anger growing inside her, but also an inexplicable guilt. Was she being unfair to Arthur? Did he really not know? And now that he did, he seemed willing to do anything to protect her. But how could she trust him? Elena looked down at her belly, feeling the baby move slightly. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, the tears flowing again. "How am I going to raise you if I don't even know how to deal with it?" Meanwhile, in the office, Arthur spent hours analyzing the documents on Calloway. He was determined to put an end to the man, not only for what he had done to Elena, but also for what he had done to Livia. When Jensen entered with a worried expression, Arthur looked at him immediately. "Any news?" "Yes, sir," replied the butler, handing him a phone. "The investigator has discovered that Calloway has hired men to break into the mansion. They could attack at any moment." Arthur clenched his fists. He knew Calloway was dangerous, but now it was clear that a confrontation was inevitable. "Get the security guards ready," he said. "I want men at every entrance and exit. And Jensen, keep Elena safe. Don't let her leave the room." Jensen nodded, but before he left, he looked at Arthur with a serious expression. "Sir, I know it's not my place to say this, but Miss Elena is scared. She needs you now more than ever. Arthur nodded slowly. He knew Jensen was right, but how could he get close to Elena now, when their relationship was so fragile? The next morning, the rising sun brought a false sense of tranquility. Elena was in the living room, lost in thought, when Arthur entered. She looked at him for a moment, the discomfort between them palpable. "I wanted to apologize," he said, taking a seat in the opposite armchair, "for everything, for not being there, for keeping it from you. I know that nothing I say can erase what you've been through, but I want to try. I want to be someone you can trust." Eleanor watched him in silence, trying to decipher his words. There was something genuine about him, something she couldn't ignore, but the pain was still too fresh. "I need time," she repeated, her voice low. "But thank you for saying that." Arthur nodded, knowing he couldn't ask more of her. But time was not on their side. Night fell over the mansion like a thick, oppressive curtain. Arthur was in his office, monitoring the security cameras installed at every point on the estate. He knew it was only a matter of time before Calloway and his men showed up. The investigators' information was clear. The attack was planned, and the mansion was the target. That's why Arthur had already taken every precaution. Earlier in the day, he made a discreet call to the police, informing them of the imminent threat. Using his influence, he managed to mobilize a team to monitor the area around the property. The objective was clear: to catch Calloway red-handed, trespassing on his property. Despite this, the tension was almost unbearable. He knew that Calloway wasn't the kind of man to back down, and even with the presence of the police, there was always the risk of something going wrong. Upstairs, Eleanor was in her room, but she couldn't sleep. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow more threatening. She felt like a cornered animal with no way out. Even though she didn't know exactly what was going on outside, she could feel in the air that something was about to happen. "Arthur," she murmured to herself while stroking her belly, "please, do whatever it takes to keep us safe." Arthur, for his part, was attentive to every movement on the cameras. Jensen was at his side, maintaining a firm posture, but even he couldn't hide his concern. "Everything's under control, sir," said Jensen, trying to reassure him. Arthur nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the screens. "Nothing is under control until Calloway is away from here," he replied, his voice low and serious. It was then that he saw it. 2 black cars slowly approached the estate, stopping a few meters before the gate. 4 men got out of the vehicles with grim expressions and calculated movements. "They're here," said Arthur, his expression hardening. Jensen immediately picked up the phone and made a quick call. The police, who were already at a nearby observation point, received confirmation that the invaders had arrived. Meanwhile, Calloway's men began forcing open the mansion's gate. The metal creaked loudly in the silent night, but before they could enter, red and blue lights illuminated the road. Sirens echoed, breaking the tension with the sound of authority. The men stopped, confused, as police cars surrounded the entrance to the estate. Officers quickly descended from the cars, pointing flashlights and shouting orders. "Hands where I can see them! You're under arrest for attempted trespass!" Calloway, who was in the second car, got out calmly, trying to keep his composure. He raised his hands, a cold smile on his face. "This is a big mistake," he said, his voice firm and calculated. "I'm just here to visit someone who has lost control of the situation." The head of the police team ignored his words, approaching with determination. "We have clear evidence that you were planning to break into this property, Mr. Calloway. I suggest you don't make things difficult." Meanwhile, Arthur watched everything on camera, taking a deep breath for the first time in hours. He knew the battle was far from over, but this was the first step towards getting Calloway out of his and Elena's lives. When the situation at the gate was brought under control and Calloway's men were handcuffed and placed in the vehicles, Arthur finally allowed himself to leave the office. He climbed the stairs quickly and knocked on Elena's bedroom door. "Arthur," she called, her voice anxious. "It's all right," he said as he opened the door. "Calloway and his men have been arrested. The police are taking care of everything." Elena covered her mouth with her hands, tears of relief streaming down her face. She hadn't known how much she had been holding back her fear until that moment. Arthur entered the room, taking a seat next to her on the bed. "They won't hurt you, or the baby," he said firmly. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes still watery. "I don't know how to thank you. You've done so much for me, and I still don't know what to think about it all." Arthur nodded, understanding her confusion. "I don't expect you to know now. I don't expect you to forgive me or trust me right away, but I want you to know that I'm going to keep fighting for you, no matter what happens." She lowered her eyes. a shy smile appearing amid the tears. "I believe in you," she said at last. It was a small step, but for Arthur, it meant more than he could express. He knew there was still a long way to go, both to protect Elena and to win her trust, but at that moment he felt he had taken the first step in the right direction. Hours later, when silence returned to the mansion, Arthur was back in his study, alone. The lights were low and he was holding an old photo of Livia that the investigator had found. "Livia," he murmured, looking at her smile in the photo. "I failed you, but I promise I won't fail our daughter." He placed the photo on the table, feeling a mixture of guilt and determination. The confrontation with Calloway was over, but the consequences were still far from gone. He knew that Calloway would use every resource he had to try to escape from prison and come back to threaten Elena. Arthur picked up the phone and made another call, this time to his lawyer. "I want all the evidence against Calloway on the table," he said, his voice harsh. "If he steps out of line again, I want him to pay for everything, for Livia, for Elena, for every person he's ever hurt." On the other end of the line, the lawyer nodded. "Understood, Mr. Cole. We'll make sure he doesn't get another chance." Arthur hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The path was still uncertain, but he was willing to face whatever came. For the first time in years, he felt like he had something to fight for, something that really mattered. Time passed, but the marks of everything that had happened were still present in Arthur and Elena's lives. Calloway remained in prison, awaiting trial, and the threat hanging over Elena had finally dissipated. But despite the apparent peace, the relationship between father and daughter remained distant. Elena didn't know how to deal with the conflicting emotions she felt. The discovery that Arthur was her father was still too recent, and although he had done everything to protect her, part of her still felt the pain of a lifetime without answers. She had refocused on her pregnancy, preparing for the baby's arrival, but avoided long conversations with Arthur. Arthur, for his part, respected Elena's distance, but each day without being able to get truly close to her consumed him. He desperately wanted to prove that he could be the father she deserved, but he knew that this depended on her being ready to accept him. Then fate intervened in a way that no one expected. Arthur began to feel inexplicably tired. At first, he thought it was just the stress of the last few months, but over time the discomfort grew. He avoided commenting on it to Jensen or Elena, preferring to ignore the signs. But one morning, as he was going downstairs for breakfast, his legs went weak. He held onto the banister, feeling the world spin around him. "Mr. Cole!" exclaimed Jensen, rushing to help him. "I'm fine," said Arthur, trying to steady himself, but his voice was weak, and he knew something was wrong. Jensen wasted no time in calling a doctor. A few hours later, Arthur was admitted for a battery of tests. Elena heard the news from Jensen and rushed to the hospital, feeling a wave of worry that she couldn't ignore. When she arrived, she saw Arthur in a hospital room hooked up to devices. He looked so different. The strong, decisive man she knew now seemed vulnerable, and that made her feel a pang in her heart. "Dad," she mumbled, not realizing that the word had come out of her mouth. Arthur, whose eyes had been closed, opened them when he heard her voice. He smiled faintly, his tired eyes shining with emotion as he heard Eleanor call him that for the first time. "Elena," he said, his voice low but full of love. "You came." "Of course I came," she replied, stepping closer. "Did you think I was going to leave you here alone?" She tried to smile, but tears streamed down her face. She sat down on the side of the bed and held his hand, something she had never done before. Arthur felt a comforting warmth in that gesture. "I was afraid of losing you," she finally admitted. "After everything that happened, I realized that I don't want to lose you, even if I'm still learning to accept you as a father." Arthur squeezed her hand gently, his smile growing. "I'm never going anywhere, Elena. I promise I'll stay here, for you and for my grandson. We'll get through this together." Eleanor nodded, crying, but this time her tears were of relief. For the first time, she felt like she had a family. Arthur faced difficult weeks in hospital, but his determination and Eleanor's support made all the difference. She was by his side every day, even on the nights he went back to the mansion to rest, always making sure he knew she was there. When Arthur was finally discharged, Elena was waiting for him in the hospital lobby. She helped Jensen into the car, and all the way home they talked about plans for the future. "I want you to be by my side when the baby is born," she said, looking at him with a sincere smile. "There's nothing I want more," Arthur replied, his eyes shining. Months later, the mansion was filled with a different energy. Eleanor had given birth to a healthy baby boy, and Arthur couldn't hide the pride he felt as he held his grandson for the first time. He looked at the little face and felt as if he had been given a new lease on life. "Welcome to the family, little one," he said with a smile. Elena watched the scene with tears in her eyes. She had never imagined that her life would take such a turn, from loneliness and fear to security and love. Arthur, who had once seemed just a distant, cold figure, was now the man she knew she could call father. "Are you ready to go back into the living room?" asked Arthur, offering the baby back to her. "Just one more minute," she replied with a smile. "I think he likes being with his grandfather." Arthur laughed, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't experienced for years. "I'll take care of you both," he promised, looking at Elena and the baby. "Nothing will separate us." The months turned into years, and the little family found the happiness that none of them had thought possible. Arthur devoted every moment to reconnecting with Elena, becoming the father she had always deserved, and Elena, in turn, learned to trust and love again, allowing the pain of the past to be replaced by the genuine affection of a new life alongside father and son. In the garden of the mansion on a sunny afternoon, Arthur played with his grandson while Elena watched them from afar, a smile on her face. For the first time in a long time, she felt that her life was complete. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered to herself, knowing that he would somehow hear her. And so, between laughter and love, Arthur, Eleanor, and the little boy found the peace they had been searching for, together, like a real family. If you liked this story and want to see more like it, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Don't miss the video that's appearing on your screen right now. Click to continue following stories that will move you.